Okay, Barry, thanks. Okay. Okay, Barry, thanks. Okay. Okay. We are live streaming on YouTube. And okay, 10:59, 1 minute and counting. I'm going to bring myself up here.
All right.
Let's see, where am I?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Here we go. Good morning. It is 11 o'clock. Welcome to Community Church of Boston, broadcasting from my home because I've got a wicked flu and a cough. It's not COVID though. If you can trust those rapid tests, it's some other garden variety flu that I've got, and I contracted it yesterday. So we're unfortunately not physically present at the beautiful auditorium of Community Church. My name is Dean. Welcome to the new faces that I've never seen before. Wonderful, warm welcome to you. We like to light a candle at the beginning. A candle for unity, a candle for purpose and justice, a candle for light. I don't know if you noticed, but this is a crooked candle. It was in the sunshine. But that's a straight one if you just turn it around like that. We have some wonderful music today. Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore had to record this in advance because they realized they are traveling. They live in Switzerland, but they live in Switzerland. However, they are traveling in the United States now. They're somewhere between New York City and Deerfield, accompanied by an African-American chorus, and they're going to do a concert in Deerfield, Massachusetts later this afternoon. So we recorded these songs. They've just done a CD and a book and a movie about antebellum, what's it called? Emancipation, abolitionist songs. And these are some songs from that project. Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore. Welcome, Matt and Yvonne.
First song we're going to do is called The True Spirit. It comes from the Emancipation Car, which is a songbook published by Joshua McCarter Simpson in 1854. And Joshua McCarter Simpson was actually a free Black man who became an abolitionist after studying at Oberlin College, and wrote many songs of this kind, and as usual used an old ballad called Rosin the Bow as the basis for his lyric.
The sound stopped.
American slave, and free the American slave, and free the American slave. Come join in your country's celebration, and free the American slave. Come all of you half-hearted freemen, your honesty now is at stake. While over the slave you are dreaming, your government standard will break. Your government standard will break. Your government standard will break. While over the slave you are dreaming, your government standard will break. We wish not to sever the union, but rather in love to unite. We hope not from our communion, no man who will strive to do right. No man who will strive to do right. No man who will strive to do right. We hope not from our communion, no man who will strive to do right. We loathe the bare name of man stealing, and all who will aid in its cause. And we are intent on repealing that outrageous fugitive law. That outrageous fugitive law. That outrageous fugitive law. And we are intent on repealing that outrageous fugitive law. We'll sacrifice time and our money and life to if it is required. While the blood of our brethren is running, we'll flinch not, nor ever grow tired. We'll flinch not, nor ever grow tired. We'll flinch not, nor ever grow tired. While the blood of our brethren is running, we'll flinch not, nor ever grow tired.
All right. Thank you, Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore from Bern, Switzerland, pre-recorded. They're wonderful. Whenever they're near Boston, we drop everything and host them in concert or as part of our Sunday program. Matt and Yvonne did a beautiful CD and book about James Connolly, the Irish politician, liberation fighter, and songwriter, James Connolly. And Matt also wrote a book about growing up in San Francisco during the flower child generation. Great guy. I would like to be sad and glad at the same time that this is our last program for the season. We're going to take Sundays off, But we have a bunch of stuff all summer long, and I hope you will stay tuned. Let's start with July 4th. There's an anti-imperialist picnic organized by Dan Kontoff and his friends on the banks of the Charles River at the Christian Herder Park in Alston, July 4th. And we will be announcing that. You can find information on our Facebook page. Sunday, July 10th at 1 p.m., we have the memorial service for Carolyn Poinelli, our beloved, very active participant in community church events and very present at the church, passed away tragically. Carolyn Poinelli, July 10th at 1 p.m. July 14th, we have a really interesting program. It's during the day on a Wednesday. And it's a group called Revolutionary Blackout Network. And this is going to be a webinar with 3 different African-American radical thinkers and programmers. This will also be a benefit for some of their work, which is around handing out food and toiletries and linens to homeless people around the Mass and Cass area of Boston. Revolutionary Blackout Network. I'm really looking forward to that. And this is the first event organized by a new person on our staff. Amar Ahmad has joined us mostly ostensibly to help us with our broadcast and our Zoom cast and our YouTube cast and editing and making this an elegant and graceful thing. But it's very apparent that he's also a very astute political mind and very good at interviewing. And this will be his first event. It was his idea, and we said, go for it, Amar. July 14th, Revolutionary Blackout Network. Next event after that, this summer, is August 9th. We're having a Nagasaki Day Observance. We haven't lined up the program, but we've done this before in past years, and we look forward to doing it again. Most of those events are Hiroshima Day, but Nagasaki Day is just as important. Why did they drop a second bomb? Never again. Not even the first one. Okay, August 13th. That's a Saturday night. An Evening with Katie Halper. I don't know if any of you follow Katie, but she's a magnificent podcaster. She has a podcast she used to do with Matt Taibbi, and now she does it with Aaron Mate. It's called Useful Idiots. And I really enjoy that podcast. It's one that I follow more assiduously than any other, really. We're calling it An Evening with Katie Halper. She's very funny. It'll be like a comedy night and also a benefit as well on a Saturday night, August 13th. Finally, September 9th will be a book presentation. Our friend Michelle Fazio is part of three authors who wrote a book about the Triangle Shirtwaist tragedy in New York, 1917, I think it was, that horrible thing happened. And this is a lot of, the authors are named Edovige Giunta, Marianne Trasciati, and Michelle Fazio. I'm looking forward to this very much. Michelle has become a part of our Sacco and Vanzetti studies and our curation of the enormous volume of Sacco and Vanzetti stuff that we inherited from Bob Datilio. Jerry Kaplan is another who is spending 3 days a week at the church just organizing and curating these materials for possible transfer over to the Boston Public Library or a few of the other anarchist collections in different parts of the country, like University of Michigan and NYU. So we're hard at work at that. If you are interested in coming down to the church I'm getting a tour of that, as well as a little look at the enormous library of books that we have, as well as the archives of Community Church, 102 years of archives that we have on the 5th floor. Really wonderful record of our history as a speaker series, our history as once the biggest church in the city of Boston met in Symphony Hall or Conservatory Auditorium or Morse Auditorium, and hosted speakers like Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, Robert Frost, Helen Keller. The list goes on, Krishnamurti. And the records of these events are up in our archives. We're also just starting to get ambitious that we have the bandwidth to really spend a lot of time organizing that archive. There's about 40 years of cassette recordings up there that we're dying to digitize and make available for people. Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks all spoke at the church. Chomsky and Zinn many times, and those little gems are sitting there waiting for us to reveal them to the world. Be in touch with us if you're interested in knowing more. Okay, and also we've designated Wednesdays for you to come down and have lunch with us. We usually have pupusas, Salvadoran delicacy, on Wednesdays, and I'd be glad to give you a tour and also give you a little taste of our enormous objective, which is to make our 5-story commercial building into a state-of-the-art model of energy efficiency and sustainability for the city of Boston, which has about 40,000 buildings, almost like this one. And we are step by step determined to make this happen. And we could tell you all the different really exciting things that are coming down on the construction and deferred maintenance front of our church's building. Okay, that is all of the announcements. I want to send an apology to Barry Warner, who actually came down physically to the church, and the church was locked up because I thought I couldn't make it down there, and just decided to do it from here. And I called a few people who regularly come physically. Mostly they're people that don't have internet access. But Barry, I'm sorry that you came to the church and it was locked. He's watching. He's with us now. He's watching from his phone in front of the church in the sidewalk cafe. Let's listen to another song by Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore. See what we got. There we go. Hey, Matt. Hey, Yvonne.
Okay, the next song is called The Band of Thieves. It was also written by Joshua McCarter Simpson, published in the Emancipation Car in 1854. The melody derives from Scots Whay, which is an old Scottish rebel song. The lyrics by Robert Burns, quite famous. But
you have to introduce
yeah, we have a book.
the reason why we're playing this song.
Yeah, I mean, folks, this is what this is all derived from. This project is called Songs of Slavery and Emancipation. It's a long story, which I won't go into here, but this book contains these songs, and you can get them and listen to them, study them yourselves. But this is called The Band of Thieves.
Who are those who loud declare all mankind their rights should share, but the slaves their chains should wear? 'Tis the band of thieves. Who are those who rule and reign, bind the black man down with chain, then his prayer and groans disdain preach and pray on the holy Sabbath day. Yet for slaves have not to say, 'tis the band of thieves. Who are those who whine and sing praises to their heavenly King, yet will call the slave a thing? 'Tis the band of thieves. Who so gentle, meek, and mild say that they are undefiled, yet will steal their brother's child? 'Tis the band of thieves. Who are those that's free from strife, would not quarrel for their life, yet will sell their brother's wife? 'Tis the band of thieves. 'Tis the band of thieves.
And the next song was actually dedicated to William Wells Brown, who was a fugitive slave and published a songbook called the Anti-Slavery Harp in 1848. It was a collection of many abolitionist songs of different styles and different composers, authors, whatever. In this case, the author of the song was a man by the name of Elias Smith, and he put it to the tune of Silver Moon. But the most significant aspect of the song was that it was sung by the Hutchinson family singers, who were among the most popular groups in America at the time and were abolitionists. And in fact, they, in many ways, actually demolished certain myths and certain distortions of history that have come down to us about the abolitionist movement, that it was somehow not popular, or that somehow it was simply middle-class do-gooders who had no connection whatsoever to the struggle of the slaves themselves. And the Hutchinsons were befriended by Frederick Douglass and had a very exciting and important career, which people should study up and find themselves. This is a song called "The Flight of the Bondman." 1, 2, 3.
From the crack of the rifle and bay of hound, takes the poor panting bondman his flight. His couch through the day is the cold damn ground, but northward he runs through the night. Oh, Godspeed the flight of the desolate slave lady's heart, never yield to despair. There is room on the hills for the true and the brave. Lady's lungs breathe out free northern air. Oh, sweet to the storm-driven sailor, the light streaming far over the dark swelling wave. But sweeter by far among the lights of the night is the star of the north to the slave. Oh, Godspeed the flight of the desolate slave lady's heart, never yield to despair. There is room on the hills for the true and the brave. Lady's lungs breathe out free northern air. Cold and bleak are our mountains and chilly our winds, but warm as the soft southern gales. Be the hands and the hearts which the hunted one finds among the hills and our own winter vales. Oh, Godspeed the flight of the desolate slave lady's heart, never yield to despair. true and the brave, let his lungs breathe out free northern air. Then list to the plaint of the heartbroken thrall. Ye bloodhounds, go back to your lair. May free northern soil soon give freedom to all who shall breathe in its pure mountain air. Oh, God, speed the flight of the desolate slave. Let his heart never yield to despair. There is room among our hills for the true and the brave. Let his lungs breathe out free northern air. There is room among our hills for the true and the brave. Let his lungs breathe out free northern air.
Matt Callahan and Yvonne Moore. Thank you. We'll have one more song from them a little bit later. And let's bring up our speaker for this morning is a new friend. And I thank Jacqueline Schwab and for recommending Greg to us. Jacqueline is that wonderful pianist who we love to have at Community Church and who we did one of our Winter Friday concerts featuring her and Edmund Robinson, her husband, doing the tech work from their house. Thank you, Jacqueline Schwab. You might have heard Jacqueline playing the piano parts on that recent Ken Burns program about Benjamin Franklin. She's on there, and as well as a whole bunch of other of Ken Burns documentaries. As Chief Justice of Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, 1830 to 1860, Lemuel Shaw was the most influential state court justice in the 19th century America. He decided cases concerning enslaved people who escaped to or were brought to Massachusetts, as well as an unfortunately influential early school desegregation case. We begin, though, with the 17th century colonies and the ship Desire. Our presenter, Gregory Williams, was a district court judge for 15 years. He retired in 2015. For his last 10 years, he was the first justice of the Edgartown District Court. He talks on such topics as Massachusetts historical crimes, notable Cape figures, such as William Sturgis and Lemuel Shaw, and the romantic macabre. His Facebook page, Gregory Williams Speaks, and I recommend you all to go there to find historical tidbits on a regular basis. Gregory Williams Speaks, it's called, the Facebook page, continues to signal his scheduled events, but also offers peeks at odd bits of history and music. Greg, thanks for joining us. And pleasure. I'm going to make you big. There you are. All right, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to try to get this. There we go. Hoping everyone can see the title page for today's talk, Slavery and Segregation in Antebellum, Massachusetts, the Law of Shaw. And thanks to the Community Church of Boston and specifically Dean Stevens for inviting me to make this presentation to you this morning on Juneteenth. The Anglo-centric view of the beginnings of slavery in what became the United States, it goes as follows, and I'm setting aside the more recent emergence of the real first enslaved people who came to what would become the United States, and that would be in St. Augustine, Florida in the 1560s. But again, the Anglo-centric version is that in 1619, the English privateer White Lion, and my slides are not working. Not sure what happened there. There's the White Lion. Okay. This ship, the White Lion, transported to the colony of Virginia about 20 people, maybe a few more. These were the first enslaved Africans, although they might have been styled indentured servants, to come to what would become the United States. The White Lion itself had captured these people from a Portuguese slave ship called São João Batista, sometimes rendered as San Juan Batista. That ship had been en route to Mexico with these enslaved people. African slavery then spread throughout the southern colonies. New England, by contrast, was notably enlightened, just filled to the brim with abolitionists. So there were no enslaved African people here in New England. New England, though, did eventually profit from what became known as the Atlantic Triangle trade. And then the whole dismal business mostly ended with the Civil War. Wrong. Certainly the part about New England and the part about the dismal business ending, at least under the name slavery. The word enormity does not just mean something of a large scale. It means something of great scale that is morally wrong. And there is no better example probably than slavery. What is difficult to do, I think, sometimes when you read or hear about slavery is to keep in your mind the breadth and the depths of the evil that was in his slavery, the depravity that slavery represents. We tend to abstract it sometimes, but we must try to keep in our minds at all times just how evil it was. English traders and settlers began enslaving indigenous people here on the continent early, certainly before Plymouth was established in 1620. Famously, in 1614, Thomas Hunt captured 20 to 24 indigenous people from Patuxet, which would become Plymouth, in order to sell them in Spain. One of those people was called Tisquandum, whom we sort of know now as Squanto, not his real name. He was gone about 5 years. After the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony were established, enslavement of indigenous peoples here continued and sort of augmented and heightened during wartime, especially the vicious Pequot War in 1636, 1638. Captives of the indigenous people, those captives would be distributed among English settlers as well as sold. Perhaps 1,000 of these people were sold in the West Indies. In 1637, for example, the ship Desired, captained by a man named William Pierce, transported 15 boys and 2 women, indigenous people, captured in the Pequot War to the Caribbean. The following year, February 1638, this is only 8 years after John Winthrop and his Puritans descended on Boston, the Desire brought to the Massachusetts Bay Colony the first recorded enslaved African people in what would become Massachusetts. When I say recorded, this information was recorded in John Winthrop's journal. Now, English settlers didn't invent slavery, obviously. They didn't invent African slavery. It just was one of those things that was more not widely questioned than questioned. Certainly people did forever, but generally speaking, it was just a fact of life for many people. These people, the people who were brought to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were purchased in the other Puritan colony that was established in 1630. This was a place called Providence Island that lies between Costa Rica and Jamaica, and it is now part of Colombia. Keep in mind the Atlantic world then, the term triangular trade has sort of gone out of fashion a little bit. Now we just speak of the Atlantic world. Britain, its colonies, Africa, very close relationship of those places with New England, and especially between New England and the West Indies. Early cash crop there was sugar. A few years later, 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony to formally authorize slavery. The ironic thing is that that authorization appeared in a document, a set of laws called the Body of Liberties. This document, among other provisions, legally permitted certain kinds of slavery, notably slavery by the English settlers of who they called strangers, that are sold to us. The term strangers comes from Leviticus. It came to mean indigenous people. It came to mean people of African heritage, or Africans themselves, obviously. Given this legal blessing of chattel slavery, of commodified slavery, of buying and selling human beings, it is unsurprising that the slave trade flourished. Numbers of the people involved here, and by the people, I mean the enslaved people, are tricky. But from 1683 to 1770, say, there were probably some 13 to 14,000 enslaved Africans who were brought to Massachusetts, mostly from the West Indies. It is estimated that perhaps up to 20% of the families in New England owned slaves by the late 17th century. From 1754 to 1763, about 2% of the population in New England was enslaved. Nearly 4,500 enslaved people in 1754 census. They were mostly in the coastal towns of New England. They were in some early industrial centers. There were not sizable plantations or farms here in New England, although there were some, quote, plantations, unquote, in Rhode Island. But because of that fact, in Massachusetts specifically, most individuals or families did not own large numbers of enslaved persons. They might have one or two. Enslaved people in New England mostly lived, quote, better, unquote, than plantation slaves in the South. They were not routinely victims of astounding brutality. But enslaved is enslaved. A person is the property of another person. Now, despite the presence of slavery here, efforts to abolish or at least curb it began quite early. Petitions from enslaved persons seeking their freedom had been entertained in some colonies since the 1640s. Enslaved people here, though, could also seek their freedom in court. The first successful trial, 1766, was by a woman named Jenny Slew. She was a 43-year-old free woman who lived in Ipswich. She was kidnapped from her home by a guy named John Whipple Jr. and forced into servitude. She eventually regained her freedom. She was also awarded money damages in a jury trial held in Salem. The argument being that her status as a slave person was determined by the race of one's mother, and not his or her father, but her mother. This is derived from a doctrine called partus sequitur ventrum. And it's a whole subject on its own. It obviously is inverse to what we normally think of as English law, where the sons have the rights and the fathers are the source of those rights. But this allowed for an increase in enslaved people because obviously there was a lot of interaction, shall we say, between slaveholders and enslaved women. And people who were born to that kind of a union took their status from their mother, the enslaved person, thereby increasing the number of slaves gratis. Jenny Slew's mother was white, and that was the critical fact in her trial seeking freedom, that her mother's race was determinative of her status. Not the apparent fact that she was free, but her mother's race. Now, when revolutionary talk of freedom and equality swirled around New England, specifically Massachusetts in the 1770s, at least 20 petitions were filed with the Massachusetts government to abolish slavery. The first one was by a gentleman known only as Felix. He apparently filed this petition, or someone filed it on his behalf, for all the enslaved people in the Commonwealth. It was kind of a class action. That was filed with the Governor's Council in 1773, and unfortunately, we do not know the outcome of that effort. But it was the Massachusetts Constitution that fueled the erosion of slavery in Massachusetts. This was a document principally drafted by John Adams. The Constitution became effective on the 25th of October, 1780. I give that date because it was less than 2.5 months before the birth of Lemuel Shaw, who we will get to shortly. Article 1 of the Declaration of Rights read in part, quote, "All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights." Of course, we always, all men. Luckily, that was changed to the word people in 1976. In 1781, the year that Lemuel Shaw was born, an enslaved woman who was about 37 years old, known as Bet or Mumbet, brought suit in Great Barrington in the Berkshires against her owner, Colonel John Ashley, based on the language in the Massachusetts Constitution, free and equal. She was joined in that suit by an enslaved gentleman named Brom. The jury, which would have been all white men, agreed that her enslavement was inconsistent with the article, and they awarded her her freedom plus £5. She then became Elizabeth Freeman. This case was persuasive in the probably better known Quock Walker cases. These were 2 civil and 1 criminal cases in Worcester County, all centered on an enslaved man named Quock Walker. These lawsuits all culminated with then Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice William Cushing declaring that the free equal language of the Massachusetts Constitution meant, quote, "The idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and Constitution, and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature." With that 1783 pronouncement from the Supreme Judicial Court, slavery was deemed ended in Massachusetts. Of course, given the state of communications then, and given the interests of slaveholders, it took a while for that word to circulate. But by 1790, the federal census recorded no enslaved people in Massachusetts. Some of these people had been magically transformed, though, into indentured servants. Shaw, at that time, was 9 years old. How does he get involved with this issue of slavery and segregation? 2 ways. As for slavery, he decided numerous cases concerning the status of enslaved people who appeared in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. How they came to be here made all the difference. The segregation case that he decided was homegrown in Boston. Lemuel Shaw was born in West Barnstable on the Cape, here where I am now, in January of 1781, toward the end of the American Revolution. The Battle of Yorktown, which was the last major land battle, would be that October. He was born in a house called the Parsonage. This house was built in 1693, which was just for context, the second year of the Salem witch trial crisis. This house still stands on Church Street off of old exit 4, I guess it is, or 5 of the Mid-Cape Highway. They've renumbered it. I don't know what the number is now, but anyway, it's right off of the old exit 5. Shaw's father was a gentleman named Oakes Shaw. He was the pastor of the nearby church for 47 years. That building is now called the 1717 Meeting House, the West Parish Congregational Church, sometimes because of his weather vane known as the Rooster Church. Oakes Shaw sent his son Lemuel to Harvard to mold him into a congregational pastor. But there, Lemuel Shaw fell in among lawyers, and he became one. He became a highly successful one, mostly with commercial corporate practice, and he eventually ended up living on Mount Vernon Street, there on Beacon Hill, 49 Mount Vernon Street, which still stands. In his early years as a lawyer, Shaw was engaged to Nancy Rowe Melville, Melvill, but she died in 1813 before they were married. Nevertheless, Lemuel Shaw carried 2 of her letters in his wallet his entire life, despite the fact that he married 2 other women during his lifetime. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court, a guy named Isaac Parker, died in 1813, died in 1830, Governor Levi Lincoln Jr. wanted Shaw to replace him. Now, keep in mind, Shaw was a lawyer. He was not on the Supreme Judicial Court. He was not a judge at all, and he didn't want to do it. One of the elements in that reluctance was the cut in pay. Shaw was getting paid quite well, thank you very much, as a lawyer. And Daniel Webster was sent to talk Shaw into it, and he did. Shaw became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court at the age of 49, which is the perfect age to become a judge. And so he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court from 1830 to 1860. As Dean mentioned earlier, he was the most influential state court judge in 19th century America. Plus, recall his tragic engagement to Nancy Rowe Melville. Shaw's daughter, Elizabeth, usually called Lizzie, married Nancy Melville's nephew, Herman Melville. Now, as a state representative, and I should say something right here, because you've got on your screen there a couple of pictures of Shaw. The one on the younger one, pre-1830, is relatively recent in its identification as being Shaw. But among Shaw's other accomplishments during his long life is he had brown hair all his life. He kept all of his hair and it remained brown. So that's a noteworthy accomplishment as far as I'm concerned. But as a state representative in 1811, Shaw described slavery as one continued series of tremendous crimes. He thought it was a great and acknowledged evil, but it was too much a part of society to be, in his words, speedily eradicated. Doing that, in his view, would devastate the enslaved population themselves, and it would ravage the economy of the slaveholding states, which he hoped would eventually plan to eliminate slavery, however gradually. And if they did not do that, there would be a great national calamity. Now, as we've noted, the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, 1780, Constitution declared that all men, people, free and equal. But the United States Constitution 1789, includes compromises, notably with the slave-holding states, because it was thought necessary to compromise with them in order to keep the Union bound together. The terms slave, slavery do not appear in the Constitution, but the so-called Fugitive Slave Clause, which is Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, provided that a person, quote, held to service or labor who escapes from one state to another must be surrendered back to the state he or she fled from. Yes, this applied to indentured servitude, but let's just say that 2 South Carolina delegates who pushed this language, one of them owed more than 100 enslaved people, which sounds like a lot. The other one owned more than 1,000 enslaved people. He was one of the largest slave owners in the United States. These were Charles Pinckney and Pierce Butler. So the clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, didn't have any enforcement mechanism. So Congress passed the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act to provide that enforcement. This statute empowered slaveholders to use federal courts and local magistrates to regain possession of runaways. The procedure was summary. There wasn't any jury. There really wasn't any trial at all contemplated. There was not going to be allowed the subject of the action, the enslaved person, maybe enslaved person, to testify on his or her own behalf. That's really not surprising because criminal defendants were not allowed to testify on their own behalf, at least in Massachusetts in the 19th century. So if that judicial officer, that magistrate, found that the person was an escaped slave, a certificate would issue, which was essentially a warrant to remove the slave from the state and send him or her back to the place that they had escaped from. Additionally, as we referred to earlier, children of fugitive enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved. Anyone interfering with the seizure of a subject alleged slave faced a $500 fine. Now, Antebellum Boston, where Shaw heard the cases that we'll be discussing, was famously the epicenter of abolitionism. Here's a kind of a stylized map of Boston. The north slope of Beacon Hill was the center of the city of Boston's Black community. Certainly wasn't called that. There was a much cruder and nastier name for the area. The abolitionist activist spirit there was kind of paralleled by such fervent white abolitionists as William Lloyd Garrison, who was able, unlike many Black people, to fuel the cause of abolitionism in a newspaper. His was called The Liberator. But however enlightened Boston was regarding slavery, there was, of course, another side. And that side considered abolitionists to be rabid revolutionaries threatening public order, threatening the unity of the nation, and threatening our money. Raw cotton was obviously grown and harvested in the South by the enslaved population brought there to do that kind of thing, but it was spun into cotton cloth here in the North. And much of the wealth of upper echelon Boston, its social leaders, its business leaders, some of whom lived on the other side of Beacon Hill at that time, separated by Pinckney Street, their money derived from cotton one way or another. And they were referred to as cotton Whigs or constitutional unionists. To them, slavery down there in the South somewhere was unpleasant, probably. Maybe it was evil, but it was justified by the Constitution and by the cause of maintaining the Union. Shaw can be thought of as being among that number. One writer wrote, "In Shaw's mind, slavery was inseparable from the very idea and existence of the nation." Now, the first slavery case that Shaw was involved in arose in 1832. It was called Commonwealth versus Howard. This was an unreported case. Some of you I know are familiar with the Massachusetts reports. This is an old volume of those reports that set out the case, if you will. But this one was unreported, didn't show up in those volumes. The case involved a woman named Mrs. Howard who lived in Cuba. She came to Boston and she brought with her a boy of about 12 or 14 years named Francisco, whom she had bought in Havana. A writ of habeas corpus was issued that brought her and this lad into the courtroom. Habeas corpus, most of you will probably know, show the body, display the body, produce the body kind of thing. So it just brings people into the court house. Once there, Howard denied that Francisco was enslaved. He was her servant, to be sure, but he was free, according to her. Apparently, there was evidence that suggested the contrary. Shaw questioned Francisco privately, and Francisco told Shaw that he wanted to stay with Mrs. Howard. Shaw reportedly signaled that if she had claimed Francisco as a slave, he would have freed Francisco. But the upshot of the whole thing was that Francisco remained with Mrs. Howard and they went on their way. Now, another unreported Shaw case arose in early August of 1836 after the Supreme Judicial Court, which I will now call the SJC, moved into the courthouse built that year. And there's Shaw with his brown hair again, and there's the courthouse that doesn't exist there anymore. That courthouse was raised in 1909. This case, though, in 1836 was the first, although probably least known, of several cases that featured dramatic rescues or fear of that kind of uproar in and around the courthouse. The captain of a brig called the Chickasaw had arrived in Boston Harbor, and on board that ship were two Black women, Eliza Small and Polly Ann Bates. An agent of their purported owner in Maryland had come to claim them as that owner's property. Again, another habeas corpus hearing. Hundreds of sympathizers toward the two women showed up, many of them women. And Shaw simply decided that the captain had no authority to detain these women, and he ordered them free, which kind of came apparently as a shock in the courtroom. The agent who had come up from Maryland to reclaim them stood up, announced that he would seek a fresh arrest under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, started asking Shaw if he needed a new warrant to do that. And meanwhile, somebody suggested to these two women that they were free and they should leave the courthouse expeditiously. Now, there were shouts of "take them, go, go." And what became known as an abolition or the abolitionist riot erupted. Reportedly, Shaw clambered down from the bench, physically tried to hold the door against the agitated multitudes who had sought to enter the courtroom. Whole new meaning of the term judicial activism. Joke. Now, exactly what Shaw did, how much peril he faced at that time are unknown, but sounds like pretty agile activity for a man that one historian, Simon Schama, actually later called, quote, an alarming mountainous presence. He, that is Shaw, sat like a great warty toad at the center of the bench, embodying in his bulk the very weight of justice. I think calling him a toad was a bit much, but anyway, Small and Bates bolted from the courthouse. They were piled into a waiting carriage out in the street, and that carriage galloped them out of town. When the carriage crossed the Mill Dam that connected Boston and Watertown, bypassing Boston Neck, there was no Back Bay then. That dam is now under Beacon Street. But toll money was thrown out of the carriage. No one was ever charged for taking part in the, quote, riot. The British Empire, including Canada, had abolished slavery 2 years before, unimaginatively called the Slavery Abolitionist Act, which was effective in 1834. And Small and Bates eventually reached Halifax, Nova Scotia. Later that same month, August 1836, Mary Slater arrived in Boston to visit her father, Thomas Avis. And she planned to stay up here for 4 or 5 months. And she brought with her a 6 or 7-year-old enslaved girl named Med. Under Louisiana law, where they lived, Slater owned Med. While they were in Boston, Med became under Avis's custody for a little while because Mary had absented herself from the city due to some ill health. Not clear on what happened there exactly. So Avis became Slater's representative or agent as to Med. Another writ of habeas corpus obtained. Always these are instigated by abolitionist forces in Boston. The issue in Commonwealth versus Avis: can a slave brought into Massachusetts for a temporary stay be deprived of their liberty while here, then taken out of Massachusetts against their consent? The abolitionists hired famed lawyer Rufus Choate, whose statue you see there, which is in the John Adams Courthouse. Lawyers sometimes used to anyway, rub the toe of his boot on the way up the stairs just for luck. And he, that is Rufus Choate, was joined by abolitionist lawyers Ellis Gray Loring, who was the mentor to Robert Morris, whom we will meet shortly, and Samuel Edmund Sewell. His great-great-grandfather, also named Samuel Sewell, was one of the Salem witch trial judges, and the only one probably noted for later regretting his role in those trials, which he did through public penance. More importantly to our present topic, though, he was the author of what is believed to be the earliest anti-slavery tract in what became the United States, a pamphlet called The Selling of Joseph, published in 1700. Defending the slave-owning Avis was Benjamin R. Curtis. Curtis, in 1851, would join the United States Supreme Court. And when that court decided the infamous Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott versus Sandford, in 1857, which held that Black people were not citizens under the U.S. Constitution, Curtis wrote a 67-page dissent. Shaw's decision in this case, Avis, Commonwealth versus Avis, recognizes slavery to be odious. The Massachusetts Constitution, conferring freedom and equal status on all, quote, men, plainly applied to slavery. In fact, he observed, it is hard to select words more precisely adapted to the abolition of Negro slavery, unquote. Nevertheless, slavery is not contrary to the laws of civilized nations. But because it is so odious, it must be acknowledged only by positive law, what he termed positive law. It's got to be in a constitution, a statute, something. There wasn't any such law in Massachusetts. Round and round, but what the case boiled down to, though, was that the Fugitive Slave Act did not apply to Med. She was brought to Massachusetts by her, quote, owner. She was not a fugitive. She didn't run here of her own accord. Shaw ordered her freed. What freedom, unquote, meant for a child of 6 years is a little unclear in the abstract. But what happened to Med is that a number of the abolitionist women in Boston assumed her custody. They renamed her Maria Somerset after a famous abolitionist and an influential English slavery case. But Maria died in the Samaritan Asylum for Indigent Children, sometimes called the Asylum for Colored Orphans, before she reached the age of 8. Some speculation is that she might have been ill before she even left New Orleans. Her mother and siblings had, of course, remained in Louisiana. And while Med lived in the asylum, the abolitionists had argued that common human decency would require that her mother and her siblings be freed to join her, Med, in Boston. That didn't happen. Now, many in the South castigated Shaw's opinion, while abolitionist sentiment praised it. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, cheered the rational, just, and noble decision of this eminent judge. But that kind of elation ignored Shaw's clear signal. Had Med been a fugitive, the outcome would have been different. That point was repeated in another case in 1844 involving an enslaved man named Robert Lucas, who was acting as a servant to his Virginia master on board the U.S. naval frigate United States. Little diversion here that I can't resist. The year before that, 1843, Herman Melville signed on to that ship, the United States, in Hawaii, and it reached Boston on the October 3rd, 1844. Lucas, this gentleman, this enslaved gentleman, Robert Lucas, inspired Melville's character Guinea in Melville's novel White Jacket in 1850. Guinea, by the way, slave ships were called Guineamen, Guinea ships. Of course, Melville became Shaw's son-in-law on August 4th, 1847. Back to the decision itself. In his decision, Shaw laid it out. Where a slave is in Massachusetts casually, not being a runaway, whether he is brought here voluntarily by his master or not, there is no law here to authorize his restraint. Lucas was freed. Here's Samuel Sewell, painting 1729, which is in the MFA, effects of the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, as part of the Compromise of 1850, Congress toughened the Fugitive Slave Act. This new version provided that law enforcement officials must arrest a suspected escaped enslaved person. If not, those officers faced a $1,000 fine. A lot of money. Who can tell how much that's worth now, but let's say at least $30,000. A successful capture of an enslaved person entitled that slave's captor to a bonus or a promotion. Not sure how that was going to be figured. Now, the evidence of the person's enslavement could be no more than the than a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership, in other words, an affidavit. Habeas corpus was irrelevant. Wasn't going to be any jury, wasn't going to be any testimony. If a commissioner found that a person was proven as a fugitive, that commissioner was compensated $10. If the commissioner found that the person was not a fugitive, he was compensated $5. Anyone providing food or shelter to a fugitive faced 6 months incarceration plus a fine of $1,000. The case of Shadrach Minkins in 1851 provided a test case for the constitutionality of this statute, the Fugitive Slave Act. Minkins' lawyers were Robert Morris, who you see here, and Richard Henry Dana Jr., whom you might recognize as being the author of 2 Years Before the Mast, very, very popular narrative of the life aboard a ship called the Pilgrim. Morris was originally from Salem. He was the second Black lawyer in the Commonwealth. So he was among the first Black attorneys in the United States. He was the first Black lawyer to try a jury case in which he prevailed. Shaw, in this case, his only involvement was that following the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he refused to issue a writ of habeas corpus. And that kind of signaled the legitimacy, the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, during all this, about 200 people had gathered at the courthouse. They exploded into a tumult led by an abolitionist named Lewis Hayden, who himself had escaped from slavery. Shadrach was wrestled away from the marshals who were holding him. He escaped into the street. He ended up hiding in a Beacon Hill attic. This fracas was immediately termed the Negro Insurrection in Boston. Daniel Webster, who was then the Secretary of State of the United States, labeled it treason. But Shadrach, happily, like the two women we discussed earlier, headed north, and he settled in Montreal. That same month as the Shadrach affair, February 1851, Thomas Sims escaped slavery in Georgia by stowing away on a ship bound for Boston. He was held in a courtroom in a courthouse that we've been discussing where federal matters were heard. The city was intent on avoiding another so-called insurrection, and they stationed 100 to 200 police officers around the courthouse and literally wrapped the building in chains. The entry into the courthouse was strictly regulated. Whoever was admitted entry had to crouch or stoop under these chains to get through the door of the building. Shaw did it, thereby earning ridicule from Richard Henry Dana. Inside the courthouse, Shaw again, as he had done with Shadrach Minkins, refused to issue a writ of habeas corpus. Ralph Waldo Emerson lamented in his journal, "What a moment was lost." Sims ended up being returned to Georgia. He was savagely whipped. He was sold to another owner in Mississippi. He eventually, though, kind of worked out for him in a way because the U.S. Marshal here in Massachusetts at the time of this incident was a guy named Charles Devens. And when he became Attorney General of the United States, he got Sims a job in the Justice Department. Somewhat ironically, I guess. Now, the most well-known Fugitive Slave Act case would come to be Anthony Burns in 1854. That one involved riots, Marines, no Shaw involvement, so we're going to skip over that. In April 1847, the father of a 4-year-old girl who lived on Andover Street on the north side of Beacon Hill applied and tried several times through her father to be enrolled in the school nearest to her house. That application was denied. Sarah C. Roberts was Black. A petition was taken up the committee chain and back, and the denials were consistent. In February 1848, Sarah went into the school nearest to her home without a then required ticket of admission. She was ejected from the school. One of the 2 Black schools in the city was called the Abiel Smith School, which was on Belknap Street, now Joy Street. And that was about 2,100 feet from the Roberts home. 5 other schools were on streets that connected with that direct route. Benjamin F. Roberts, her father, refused to have Sarah attend the Smith School. The Black community of Beacon Hill had supported Black schools in Boston, as they were sometimes supported in the South. But support waned as schools themselves became dilapidated and the curricula were different. The Boston Primary School Committee oversaw 161 primary schools. These were for very young students, ages 4 to 7 in Boston. Petitions to that committee to desegregate Boston's primary grammar schools in the 1840s had failed. Its response to one petition, the one in 1846, was Black school children's, quote, peculiar physical, mental, and moral structure requires an educational treatment different in some respects from that of white children. There was a statute in 1845 that provided that if any child were unlawfully excluded from public school instruction, the child, through a parent, could recover damages from the offending city or town through a lawsuit in the child's name. When Sarah was ejected from that white school nearest her house, Roberts, her father, consulted Robert Morris. Now, you'll remember pioneering Black attorney Robert Morris. He now became the first lawyer in the United States to file a civil rights case challenging segregation in public schools. And to assist him, Morris engaged Charles Sumner. Sumner then was a private practice lawyer and a towering figure. Literally, he was 6'4", and figuratively in the cause of abolitionism, both at this time and during his 23 years in the U.S. Senate. He is known for the aftermath of a powerful speech against the slave power he had delivered in Congress in 1856. A few days after that speech, Representative Preston Brooks confronted Sumner at his Senate desk. Before Sumner could rise to his 6'4", Brooks began beating his head with a heavy cane, blinding Sumner with his own blood on the floor of the Senate. Sumner was gravely injured physically and psychologically and did not return to the Senate for 3 years while his seat was being held. Another little sidebar here. The Roberts matter was heard in November 1849, by which time Sarah was 6 years old. And a little more than 3 weeks after that, Harvard Medical School professor John White Webster murdered and dismembered George Parkman at the Harvard Medical School, which at that time was down near Mass General Hospital. Shaw would go on to preside over that very lurid trial and write an influential opinion about matters in criminal law, such as reasonable doubt. Back to Roberts. Sumner argued in Roberts in an echo from the argument that had freed Mumbet from slavery almost 70 years before. Equality of man, of people before law, as established in the Massachusetts Constitution, demanded that segregation not exist anymore. Legislation establishing public schools did not empower a school committee to, quote, brand a whole race with the stigma of inferiority and degradation. Doing that was unreasonable and therefore not allowable. Sumner might not have used the exact phrase separate but equal, but that's exactly what he was arguing against. A Black school could not be equivalent to a white school because Black schools imposed inconveniences and stigma of caste on Black children. They, Black students, he emphasized, were entitled to precise equality. Sumner went on to argue in points that sound remarkably modern that white people were also harmed by this kind of separation. White children were being taught to deny the brotherhood of man, which hardens their hearts. He said, quote, "Prejudice is the child of ignorance. It is sure to prevail where people do not know each other." Arguing for the city was city solicitor, a municipal law specialist named Peleg W. Chandler. Shaw was not swayed by Sumner's morality-based position, but he apparently adopted much of Chandler's argument. He recognized Sumner's point about persons being equal before the law, but that, what he called a great principle, was unrealistic in application. Men and women, he said, do not have the same civil and political powers. Children and adults are not subject to the same treatment, in his words. All equality meant was that the rights of all entitled to the paternal consideration and protection of the law for their maintenance and security. Rights depend on laws. Shaw conceded that Black people are entitled to equal rights, but the question is whether the regulation providing separate schools for Black children violated any of those rights. He concluded that the school committee had the power to regulate the educational system of Boston unless that power were abused or perverted. Was not in this case. He ended his decision by suggesting that Sarah's having to walk a little farther to school was not unreasonable. Missing the point. But before that, he addressed Sumner's argument that segregation perpetuated, quote, the odious distinction of caste founded in a deep-rooted prejudice in public opinion. If that prejudice exists, Shaw declared, in a well-known phrase, it is not created by law and probably cannot be changed by law. And on that point, unfortunately, he was correct, at least in the sense that separate but equal, principle usually deemed to be solidified in this Roberts decision, was an authority relied upon by the United States Supreme Court 47 years later in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Slide there. That gentleman is, the internet would have you believe that that gentleman is Homer Plessy, but it is not Homer Plessy. It's a gentleman called PBS Pinchback, which is a great name. In 1892, Homer Adolph Plessy volunteered to be a plaintiff in a test case challenging the Louisiana Separate Car Act, which created train cars for whites only. In the neurotically stratified racial world of New Orleans, Plessy was an octoroon. He was 1/8 Black. Very light-skinned man. That's why he was chosen to fulfill this role. He was charged with violating the Separate Car Act. He appeared before Judge John Howard Ferguson, who I mentioned because he's the Ferguson in the style of the case, the title of the case, and he was from Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard. Case finally got to the United States Supreme Court. Segregation was legal as long as Black people and white people had equal facilities, which they didn't. And that ruling stood for 60 years until Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. Actually, there were a number of cases that joined in that action, but the Brown of that case was Linda Carroll Brown. And her suit was brought by her father and her next friend, Oliver Brown. Linda could not attend school, the closest to her home, which was in New Orleans, 9th Ward, just like Sarah Roberts in Boston. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. The notion of separate but equal was unconstitutional. The court declared to separate Black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Well, what happened to Sarah Roberts? No one knows. Homer Plessy was pardoned in Louisiana for his crime in January of this year, 2022. Linda Brown became a teacher, a speaker, an advocate, and she died in March of 2018. Back to Shaw briefly. Here's Shaw as, well, he's nude, to be blunt about it. Roman emperor, I guess. This is the bust that's now in the Barnstable Superior Courtroom. Shaw retired in August of 1860. 7 months later, he died of a stroke in Boston at the age of 80. He is buried in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, igniting the great national calamity that Shaw feared if the South did not voluntarily eliminate slavery. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And that's it, Dean. Oh, I can't hear him.
Now you can hear me.
Ah, there you go, Dean.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Hope this wasn't too long.
Not at all. We are a movable feast, and that was a treasure trove of incredible information and stories.
Thanks. Thank you.
We all thank you. I'm trying to spotlight for everyone. Finally. There were several things in there that that caught my attention. One is the Lothrop room in the Barnstable Library.
Yep.
Which you'll be interested to know is probably related to our minister, Donald Lothrop, who was minister for 39 years of Community Church, direct descendant of the Lothrop who founded that church in Barnstable, if I'm not mistaken. And I think emigrated from England, brought his flock and founded that church. And this, our Lothrop was maybe his great grandson or some, maybe a few more greats in there, because that was the 1700s.
I know a little bit about that story because I'm the immediate past president of the Board of Trustees of Sturgis Library. And that bust, that picture of that bust that I show you, that is in a portion of the library that was John Lothrop's home, built in about 1644. So he has plenty of descendants, and I'm sure your Lothrop up there was one of them.
Yes, and we were still in touch with his daughter, who lives in Seattle, and she gave us a presentation during our 100th anniversary, and also with his daughter-in-law, the son who's named John Lothrop, passed away. He lived in Maine. So we've got one more song from Matt and Yvonne. Let's hear them, and then we'll have some time for some conversation. There they are, and while you're listening to this song, I want to tell you that Community Church of Boston relies on your generosity. We are very proud of this series of speakers that we present to the city of Boston and to the planet. And during this song, I'm going to put up our website where you can go, and there are two possibilities there. There's a credit card and there's PayPal. There's also the old-fashioned check that you can write to our address, which I will also include. Here they go. Thank you, Matt and Yvonne.
This next song is called The Song of the Alien American. It was also written by Joshua McCarter Simpson and appeared in the Emancipation card. I think everybody will know the song when they hear it.
My country, 'tis of the dark land of slavery, in thee we groan. Long have our chains been worn, long has our grief been borne, our flesh has long been torn, even from our bones. The white man rules the day, he bears despotic sway over all the land. He wields the tyrant's rod, fearless of man or God, and at his impious nod we fall or stand. Oh, shall we longer bleed? Is there no one to plead the black man's cause? Does justice thus demand that we shall wear the brand and raise not voice nor hand against such laws? No, no, the time has come when we must not be dumb. We must.
I'm sorry, we got to do it again.
Oh.
Apologize.
Let's fast forward. I
He
forgot.
bears despotic. Oh, shall we longer bleed? Is there no one to plead the black man's cause? Does justice thus demand that we shall wear the brand and raise not voice nor hand against such laws? No, no, the time has come when we must not be dumb, we must away. We now 8 million strong must strike sweet freedom's song and plead ourselves a wrong, our chains must break.
Oops, I forgot that there was I was supposed to edit something out there. But thank you to Matt and Yvonne for joining us. It was so great that we were able to pair them with Greg's presentation. Let me see. We want to hear from Joan Livingston. Go ahead, Joan. Hi, unmute yourself. And
Hi.
There she is. Hi,
I
Joan.
didn't mean to put my hand up. I'm sorry, I came late. I have a question. I wonder whether Greg covered the fact that Mass Bay was the first colony to legalize slavery and that there was a triangle trade, not just black and white, but natives sent to the islands. The Irish were enslaved on Barbados, where they produced sugar and rum. And then Africans were the third leg of that triad. So it's interesting because a lot of, like Faneuil Hall, Faneuil was a slaver, Boylston Street, Boylston was a slaver. A lot of this, it's a city state, which, and I'm interested because we recently heard talk about insurrection. There was a Negro insurrection as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act. Lincoln did a lot of compromises that ended up not really, he's known as the great liberator, but in fact, I think Helen Keller put that best, that the Civil War was a fight, a war between the Northern industrialists and the Southern industrialists, who it was, industrial capitalism versus agrarian, over who would get to steal the West. And of course, Lincoln hired Buffalo soldiers to clean out the plains. So anyway, the question was, did Greg cover the whole triangle trade or just black and white?
Oh, Joan, you must have missed the first part of the talk. I covered that in exquisite detail.
Thank you. I'll watch on
No,
YouTube.
I did mention that. It was tough because obviously the subject of the talk is Lemuel Shaw's involvement in the cases that arose here in Massachusetts. Right. Try to give a little background to that fascinating topic, as you've indicated.
And it's still an amazingly racist city. That Brown versus Board wasn't implemented until the 70s. I mean, and that the neighborhoods are by ethnic. I don't say race because that's a construct. It's a socioeconomic. It's wonderful having a white woman sing a song about white men, because it's a patriarchy, right? Yeah. And people of color, so-called, sometimes you can't tell. If you're a Native person, you may look perfectly white, but the Puritans were so anti-First Nations people. I mean, there were a lot of, literally a Holocaust, which means death by fire of the Pequots.
That's right.
And so, I mean, they were very big on the Old Testament and last days, but they seem to have skipped that Moses stuff. Do not kill, steal.
Right.
Very religious folk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And some witches.
Yeah. And don't be a Quaker either.
Dane was talking about Barnstable, and on the Cape, if you were Native, you would want to stay away from, Plymouth was Pawtuxet, but the Friends, the rest of the Cape, they were very open to First Nations people. It's kind of an interesting that they did not see them as different. I think a Quaker, I had a great relative who was very busy in abolition. She was not fond of Lincoln. She worked for universal suffrage for African Americans, Native Americans, and women. She was way above her, before her time. This was she actually co-founded the Anti-Slavery Society. I learned that she was a Quaker. I learned about Quakerism a lot. And my dad wrote a book about her. And she died before any of those groups was able to vote. And there's a woman who was so late to the cause that everyone knows. She called her Banthony for being very late and getting all the publicity. But there's Martha Coffin Wright, and her life story is one of John Brown, who was also in David Robick's song. He says Indians, but fighting for rights of everyone. And Lincoln called him a fanatic, right? He was a Christian, and sometimes being a Christian is not a good thing. It depends on the person, but he believed, perhaps, let's imagine what Jesus looked like, right? He was probably pretty tan. So I'm sorry, I will watch the whole YouTube later. I apologize for coming in late.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thanks for that insight.
The documents you showed are tremendous. I would love to share them. It's like, colored people don't talk to policemen. I mean, those are wonderful. If I could put them up on Meta.
Yeah, Sarah Roberts's father printed that one, that particular one.
That is a,
Be on the
that-
watch. Keep top eye open.
When
was
they
it- was
began
it slogan?
talking about insurrections 17 months ago, I went through my books on Kindle and I looked for, Shea, for example, that's a bunch of Continental Army veterans, and they were considered, they had property, but they were put down because they wanted to be paid. So the Massachusetts Constitution didn't do much for them either. That was an early insurrection where you look and you say, but they were on the right side of the law, right? You've got people like Washington who like stride into history, and he paid more for his mulatto slaves than his Negro boys, and he killed the Seneca and Lenape, and this is a great man, It's like that the racism is really a pre-founding,
Agreed.
Dorothy. Hi, Dorothy. Thanks, Joan.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Dorothy.
Okay. Hi. I
Hi.
thought it was great talk, very interested in it.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you, however, if you would kind of might you summarize? Might you be able to tell us what is your overall judgment of this man? What characterizes him, in your opinion? And another question I have is, have you ever researched what happened in Connecticut or what happened in some of the other New England states? Are there some interesting developments that were comparable, or were we ahead in some way?
Well, you say ahead. I'm not sure that we were ahead on much of this, and that goes back to your point about Lemuel Shaw's character. He was a conservative. He was a conservative guy, and he was very much fixed on what might be called a narrow interpretation of the law, at least in this regard. And by this regard, I mean the issue of slavery cases and segregation. He could have, for instance, gone Sumner's way in the Roberts case. He could have tackled perhaps the issue of the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act, but he didn't. It was, in his view, what it was, and that's going to be the basis of the decision. So he was not.
Or is it basically, did he get worse in some sense? Was he better in the beginning, or the cases appealed to him in the beginning? It seemed like he was a hero, and then he became less of a hero, as I kind of thought I understood.
That's kind of right, but when you say he was a hero, it was only because he was able to look at for instance, the early cases when he said, well, I'm going to free so-and-so because she's not a fugitive. I'm looking at the language of the Fugitive Slave Act, and this person is not a fugitive. She was brought here. She didn't escape to here. So he had a narrow view of a lot of these things. He was one of those cotton wigs in a sense. He didn't really directly profit from the cotton trade the way a lot of other people in Boston did, but he had that same kind of mindset. He was essentially conservative, not a nasty conservative. That came later, but he was a straight-laced conservative guy. And so it's sometimes a little jarring to read about him playing with Herman Melville's kids out in the Berkshires. He was a champion horsey, for instance, to those little kids out there. So when you read that about him, I mean, that was not the image he certainly projected in the courthouse in Boston. Conservative guy.
I see. And Connecticut has no history that's comparable that you know about?
Well, that I know
In
about,
terms of
no.
things.
I don't.
Okay.
Whatever they do down there, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
I know that they named themselves
Thanks for the
after
talk.
I know that they named themselves after nutmegs, and that's because nutmegs were counterfeited. The spice nutmegs was counterfeited in Connecticut. That's how they got their name. So,
Wow.
I just throw that out there. Is anybody from
Dorothy?
Connecticut? I don't think so.
if you're interested in talking about Connecticut, talk to Crystal Rollins Jackson, who is our publications manager and marvelous office manager. She is an African American and Native American woman, and she's researched all kinds of ancestry and all kinds of history in this regard, and she talks about Connecticut quite a bit. So that's one thing. The next thing I want to just direct everybody to a very large permanent display. It's almost permanent. It's in the Brook Courthouse, and Greg, it covers a lot of the same cases, and it's basically a history of African American and meeting the judicial system of Massachusetts.
There's a lot of Robert Morris stuff in that. I think I've seen that display some years ago. Very interesting and well done.
It is now in the Brook Courthouse, which is kitty-cornered from the Haymarket State Orange and Green Line station.
New Shard
Another
Street.
thing I want to tell you, Greg, is that I really wish you could meet our friend Dylan Boston, who is a playwright and songwriter. He wrote a play that was called Top Eye Open.
Top Eye Open. Right off that poster.
It was about the fugitive slave days and some of these different cases. And it was a marvelous play. It was presented at the Hibernian Hall in Roxbury. And you should also know about him because he also wrote a book, a play that's called Tide Book, and it's all about Martha's Vineyard. Just a whole series of stories about Martha's Vineyard characters.
Oh, there are plenty of characters there.
Plenty of characters. You know, It starts with the daughters of Eldridge, who wrote that Tide Book. Tides, and it goes on to all these different people from Martha's Vineyard. Wonderful play. Anyway, I had to mention that when you.
I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
Dylan Boston, it's his name.
Dylan Boston.
Yeah. Let's see. In the chat. Karen mentions that Dudley Square was renamed Nubian Square.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Was Dudley a slave trader?
That I assume that was named after the governor.
Governor. Yeah.
That's my guess. I don't know that for sure, but there was obviously a governor named Dudley. Probably the derivation.
Right in the middle of Nubian Square was a long time a store that was called Nubian Notions. It closed, but that might have had something to do with the naming of it that way. Another one from Karen. We are still living with the remnants of slavery. Are you familiar with the murder of Anthony Hardin by the Fall River Police? And she includes a Facebook link.
I don't think I am, but I will be now. I will make myself familiar with that.
A bunch of other observations in the chat. We're getting near the end. We want to thank you, Greg, for joining us, and apologies for not being able to make it an outing to Boston, and we will make that happen. And we'd love to hear your presentation about Sacco and Vanzetti, and also give you a tour of our Sacco Vanzetti room. And also,
would love that.
We have a plaque, which is a plaque made by Gutzon Borglum.
Oh yes,
the defiler of the sacred Black Hills.
Right.
But he made this beautiful plaque, and we have a copy of it in our auditorium, and lots of other things to see. So we will get you back. Okay.
I appreciate it.
I promise. Are there any other announcements or observations before we go into the rest of our Father's Day? And happy Father's Day to all of you dads out there, and all of you moms.
Didn't they just have a day in May?
Moms did, yeah. Dan, you have your go ahead, Dan.
Karen posted. I want to make sure everybody's invited to our anti-imperialistic picnic this year. is embracing everything that was talked about today in imperialism, and all kinds of issues connected to are brought to the picnic, because what represents those of us who do not celebrate July 4th. Because how can you celebrate a country that I won't go any more on that issue, but the idea is July 4th, we have a great time. We have 4 grills, 2 vegan, 2 non-vegan, plus other things we cook on the grills. Music, we have live music. Right now working on performers to come perform all afternoon. So we have nice music and good conversation. It's a potluck, barbecue, picnic for those of us who don't want to go downtown and be part of the madness. And
Dan, tell us where and what time. Where and what time?
Starting at noon. I'll get there myself at 10 or 11, set up. We'll have some easy up tents so you can stay in the shade. And it's going to be a great time right there by Channel 4, across the street from Channel 4. There's parking there in a couple lots. So
next to the kayaks. Next to the kayaks, right?
Dean, you know better than I do. So go for it.
Around there. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, especially to the names that I don't know on this Zoom list. We want to reach out to you and invite you to come down on a Wednesday and find out more and get a tour of our building. We invite you to participate in a number of events that I listed earlier. There's several things, great things going on this summer at Community Church. Join in. If you want to be a member, there's a book to sign, and you could do that on a Wednesday when you came in for lunch. There's all you have to do is sign a book, and it'll give you a little more intimate window into who we are, what we do, what our history is, what our present and our future wants to be. Karen or Charlie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, we quickly looked up on the web, Karen did, that Governor Dudley was a slave owner.
1641. But the irony is the Nubians in Africa also owned slaves in Africa. So
there's so many ironies to do they call it the peculiar institution?
Peculiar institution.
There were Native people who owned black slaves.
Right.
Including something that Dylan Boston told me, which was the author of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, was a Native who owned black slaves. I don't know where he found that little piece of information, but I've never been able to sing it the same.
No. Well, there's a lot to chase down here.
Folks, thank you for joining us. Greg, thank you for the beautiful presentation. I look forward to finishing it out on our YouTube channel where it will be available. I will send a link to you. I will also be sending to everybody a summary of some of the phenomenal talks that we've had over the past year, just links to a bunch of different great material that we have covered. It's been a rich year. And goodbye, but not for long, because we have several events this summer. Keep your top eye open, and
there you go.
And we will keep you posted as to what's coming up next. Join our mailing list. You can email comchurch@gmail.com, 2 M's, comchurch@gmail.com, and Crystal will put you on our email list. And with that, we declare the meeting to be over. And I would sing "Meeting at the Building Soon Be Over," but my singing voice is very lacking right now. So I'm just going to say thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks again,
Dorothy, Charlie, Joan,
hello from Maine. Hello,
Kevin,
from Maine.
Lenny from Maine.
Thank you.
Karen and Charlie, Faye, Edward Bell. Nice to meet you, Edward Bell. Mary Lynn, Dinah, and Ausra, and Alan, and 508. I won't repeat your phone number. And thank you to everybody who joined us on YouTube. There's, last time I checked, there were about 10 people on the YouTube channel. So with that, we are just for fun going to save the chat. If anybody wants some of the information before I